Well, they say all good things must come to an end. And Mr. Dawes is back. He's sitting next to me with a sombrero on his head, a straw donkey under his arm and a glass of sangria in his hand. As you were then.
This is Partners in Crime with Adam Croft and Robert Dawes.
Buenos dias, Bob.
Buenos dias, amigo. Well, thank you for that. It's very nice. What am I saying thank you for? I don't know. Well, I should be thanking you for that introduction. But needless to say, it's very nice to be back.
Back in a warm country now.
In the studio here, and after a little sojourn, which wasn't all holiday. It was very much a busman's. I've been doing some research over in Spain for a project I'm working on. So it wasn't all sangria and chips.
Did you miss the lovely weather while you were over in Spain, though?
The weather was wonderful over there. In fact, it was a little cooler than it was over here, apparently. But no, it was very nice. And I managed to survive a week without getting one mosquito bite.
Wow.
But after a 2-hour flight from Alicante on EasyJet, I got bitten about 30 times.
Yeah. There are all sorts of things biting us around here. I mean, down the back of my garden, a stream runs down there. And when you have this hot weather, there are all sorts of midges and mosquito-type things that are out there biting us. But,
well, I was all right in Spain. It was, I think, what they were doing. There must have been, 100 mosquitoes trying to get to Luton Airport. So they got on the plane at Alicante and feasted on the passengers.
If you have more alcohol in your system, they tend to leave you alone. So that's maybe why when you're on holiday you don't get bitten as much.
Oh,
because you had so much sangria.
But I was entirely teetotal while I was away. I was working, as you know.
Oh, of course you were. Of course you were.
He said, his nose expanding at a massive rate.
So what else have you been up to this week other than being bitten alive?
Well, I've been doing some research and having to swim, which was very, very pleasant, and that's what the summer holidays are all about. But coming round to this week's recommendation, well, it's going to return recommendation, and I know this is my new The Bridge, but Chris Lang's Unforgotten, made for ITV by Main Street Productions, is having a huge successful run.
I'm with you on
ITV.
this one as well. It's one of those only programmes I've been watching as it's been going out, more or less.
Well, it's fantastic, and Chris is certainly becoming the preeminent screenwriter of crime thrillers on television at the moment, and deservedly so. But lots of people have been saying, well, we're not in the UK, so how do we watch it? Well, Unforgotten Season 3, it airs on Sunday nights at 9 p.m. on ITV, starring the wonderful Nicola Walker playing DCI Cassie Stewart, and the equally wonderful Sanjeev Bhaskar playing DI Sunny Khan. The third series is every bit as good as the previous two. It really is fantastically, beautifully produced, acted, and
if not better.
Chris Lang at the helm, beautifully written. Intriguing stuff. So, how do you watch it? Well, episodes are added to the broadcaster's streaming platform. That's the ITV Hub shortly after the initial broadcast. So if you've missed it, you can get it on catch up. But that's only available in the UK. So, however, the good news is that season 1, which had another wonderful cast, headed by Tom Courtenay and Gemma Jones, is available on Netflix. That's just season 1. But the other two seasons 2 and 3, aren't added yet, but I'm sure they will be. But for people frustrated worldwide who happen to be on Amazon Prime Video, they have a subscription for that, they can watch the series with the ITV Plus add-on for just $3.99. Also, season 1 and 2 can be bought on Amazon Instant Video for, I think, a very reasonable price of £12.49 per season, or whatever that is translated to in dollars or euros or whatever currency.
Trust me, that's a bargain. It
really
is.
Program. So watch it if you can. It's going down a storm in the UK. If you haven't caught it and you live in the UK, catch up with it on catch up, but there are other ways of getting it if you are in Tobago or
and at least one of you is. We know that.
Lithuania.
Yes.
I sold a book in Lithuania this week.
Did you?
Yes.
That might be a Lithuanian listener.
It's probably our sole Lithuanian. Thank you, sir or madam. But also, the recommendation is Chris Lang's Unforgotten ITV, but on many different amazing platforms worldwide.
And if you fancy reading a book at any point, as well as watching great TV drama...
But we cover such a broad...
We do, but I've got a segue into the promo.
Oh, you've got a segue? Oh,
yeah.
What were you saying about books and segueing?
Good question. If you wanted to read a book this week, then your best bet as a listener to Partners in Crime would be to go and grab an ebook from Kobo, because as a listener to Partners in Crime, you get 90% off your first ebook purchase with Kobo, which is a marvellous offer and is exclusive to Partners in Crime listeners. Just go to kobo.com, find the book that takes your fancy, and enter the promo code CRIME at the checkout, and they'll give you 90% off. And the author doesn't lose out either. The author still gets paid the same commission.
Yes, I've been.
And Kobo take the hit, which is very good of them.
Isn't that wonderful and very kind of them? And I do an appreciative whistle at this point, but today I'm going to take a big slurp of coffee.
The coffee's become a bit of a thing, actually. I've noticed lots of tweets coming in about coffee and people mentioning coffee.
Well, we do like a cup of coffee.
I haven't drunk.
No, you don't drink coffee.
I haven't drunk coffee in 2 years.
Yes, I'm the one who's hyper. You're the one who sits there in a Buddhist state of inner reflection.
This is all natural.
Yes. Is it? Listener, if you were sitting where I am, you'd probably question that.
It's mostly red wine, I'll be honest. But, other than that, my enthusiasm is entirely natural.
It's 11 in the morning.
Well, no. That's why I've only had the one bottle.
So maybe you've segued back to sangria.
Well, yes. It all comes full circle. You see, we've designed this. It's lucky we scripted it, isn't it?
Olé. Cafe Olé.
You know what? Talking about going round in circles, I know a Cafe Olé in Spain.
Whereabouts in Spain?
Oliva.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Where's Oliva?
God knows. It's not far from Benidorm. We're about half an hour drive down there, sort of Gandia, Valencia way.
I thought this was a set-up for a gag, but it's it's a geographical.
We were talking about bringing
lesson.
it full circle, and you've just done it again.
Oh, well, there we are. I'm sure... can I hear our listeners falling to sleep at our jolly, exciting bat?
Well, I think we should probably return to crime fiction. Should we do that with a guest interview?
Yeah, what a good idea. And what a guest we've got this week.
Yes. One I've been wanting to speak to for so long. We've been trying to get him on. We finally managed to find the time when he could do it. He's a very busy man, as you'll find out. But as a big fan of his books myself, and as a regular visitor to that corner of the world, I feel that... yes, it's going to be a great interview. Brian McGilloway is the New York Times best-selling author of the critically acclaimed Inspector Benedict Devlin and D.S. Lucy Black series of books based in the borderlands of Northern Ireland. His first novel, Borderlands, was shortlisted for the CWA New Blood Dagger in 2007. The second novel in the series, Gallows Lane, was shortlisted for, amongst other awards, the Theakston's Old Peculiar Crime Novel of the Year in 2010. In 2014, Brian won BBC Northern Ireland's Tony Doyle Award for his screenplay Little Emperors, an award which saw him become Writer-in-Residence with BBC Northern Ireland. Welcome to the show, Brian. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I mentioned Northern Ireland, I think once or twice there in that introduction, and you are intrinsically linked with that border area in Northern Ireland that I know quite well myself. How has that kind of informed the books? Because, I mean, it's not that area, it's not just a matter of geography, is it?
No, it's kind of one of those strange things. When I grew up with it. So it kind of seemed normal to me until you kind of go other places and realise that it's not. I grew up in Derry or Londonderry, depending on which side of the political divide you were on. A city that was split down the middle by a river. So I kind of grew up in a city that was kind of divided and had two different names. And the city was only maybe 15 minutes away from the border, where there was another division. And particularly, I suppose, for us as kids, was a division we were very aware of, because the border was completely militarized. Whenever you crossed over the border, and crossing the border for us, I mean, it sounds like something kind of significant. For us, it was every Sunday we went for a drive to the beach or to the local seaside town to buy ice cream. And you had to cross the border to do it. And it was perfectly normal routine for us, except it involved driving through a military hangar where at times you were taken out of the car and the car was searched and your father was searched and the boot was emptied. And then as we grew up and I suppose as the border vanished, the area where those hangars had been remained, but there was nothing on them anymore. And they just became this kind of grey no man's land between what was recognisably the north and what was recognisably the south. And then I suppose over the past couple of years, with the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process and so on, it became harder and harder to tell where the line had been. And with the first book, Borderlands, what really interested me was that idea of if it snows and everything is gone, all the kind of all the buildings and the militarization has gone. When it snows, the whole place just looks exactly the same. There's no sense of where the border is. And I kind of like that as a metaphor for the main character who has kind of issues over boundaries in terms of what's acceptable and what's not. I mean, in the first book, he spent his time going backwards and forwards over the border, interviewing people in a different jurisdiction from his without really giving it a second thought. And I suppose it was that idea. It was about how do you police that area? How do you kind of control an area that has a porous boundary and that has a boundary that increasingly is vanishing? And yet for some people is very real and needs to be very rigid. And that, I suppose that was it. Do you know what I mean? Because I kind of grew up in a city that was split and grew up in a country that was kind of split into north and south. That idea of division and boundaries and liminality, and I suppose it kind of made sense that it would feed into the books, particularly the early books.
Yeah, I mean, borders, boundaries and divisions, as you say, are very much the theme there in the early books, and very much a part of life in the area where you lived in, like, say, society, the country, the city. That's really rich pickings for a crime novel, isn't it? Because you've got the atmosphere there. You've got... I was talking with Jay Stringer on the show last week, and we were talking about how crime fiction becomes more popular at times when society is divided. Now crime fiction is the most widely read genre. I think perhaps one of the reasons is because society is in a position where it's very divided, and people like to see things resolved and things working out at the end of the book, whereas when things were going fine 15, 20 years ago, disaster movies and 28 Days Later and things like that were very much the flavour of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that kind of cathartic experiencing of disorder and division, but kind of vicariously knowing that there's going to be a safe resolution at the end, knowing that somebody's going to sort things out, that order will be kind of reinstated. I do think that that's a big kind of attraction with crime writing, in the same way that it was with ancient tragedy. You know what I mean? I think crime fiction in a way is just our iteration of our tragedy.
I mean, how do you balance that against that backdrop of Northern Ireland? Because that's an area that even now, politically speaking, things are delicate. There's always, I mean, even though we had the Good Friday Agreement and things have been so much better for so long, there's still that kind of delicate sense that perhaps there's still something bubbling under the surface, some pockets in some areas. How did you kind of deal with that in terms of writing your books and making sure that you were kind of, I don't know, sensitive to that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that kind of undercurrent, that bubbling undercurrent has really, I suppose, kind of come to the fore over the past year or two. And in the kind of post-Good Friday years, I think there was generally a sense that, right, this is us now, we're kind of moving forward, we're beginning to deal with stuff. I suppose there's two different things in that. I mean, one of them is I don't really know if crime fiction had a role, had as vital a role to play during the worst years of the violence. There were very, very few people who were writing crime. And I think part of the reason for that is that if there is this kind of vicarious experiencing of fear and crime, you don't need that. If there's real fear happening, if there's real violence happening on the streets.
I suppose nothing you wrote could have been, scarier than the truth at that time.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that crime, I mean, with some exceptions, like people say, like Colin Bateman, who were writing kind of humorous crime, and Eugene McEldowney, who was a journalist who wrote police procedurals during the kind of worst years of the violence and then stopped, and is writing now under a different name and a different genre. But I think kind of what happened was there was no opportunity here for there to be a truth commission. There was no opportunity here for a society to kind of say, right, we need to look now at what happened. We need to assess what happened. We need to work out what version of history is actually true. Because the agreement was about a compromise that brushed some stuff under the carpet, kind of understandably so, and in which every side claimed that it was the victor. And if it's the victor who writes history, but you have every side claiming victory, then you're getting lots and lots of different versions of history. And I think what kind of crime fiction allowed those of us here who were writing about the kind of experience here to do was to kind of take a step back from it metaphorically in terms of writing a fiction rather than a kind of fact. But to look at what happened and to try to present versions of what we understood our history to have been. And I mean, I think what's quite interesting is the further away we got from the violence, the further back some writers were starting to go. I mean, if you look at some Adrian McKinty, who's a fantastic writer, that Sean Duffy series is set right at the very heart of the worst years of the violence. And it's only been maybe in the past 5 or 6 years that Adrian's been writing those. So I do think there was kind of a sense of writers maybe trying to be truthful, and to kind of take it, as I say, a step back and go, right, how did we get here? Because I mean, crime fiction itself, crime fiction as a genre is both forward and backward looking simultaneously. I mean, it starts with a crime, obviously, and the narrative drive is to try to solve the crime.
Yes.
But in order to solve the crime, the detective has to spend their entire time looking back to try to work out what happened to lead up to that point at the start of the book where the crime happened, where the body was found. So it's kind of simultaneously doing two things. It's both backward looking and forward moving.
Well, that's interesting, Brian, because obviously the structure of the person's sort of crime writing style and its books. It's Bob here, by the way. How are you? All right. Hi. So, yeah, I mean, which leads to something I've been thinking about for listeners of the podcast coming to your writing fresh. What would you say are the main differences in style and content between your Inspector Devlin and D.S. Lucy Black series, and where would you point them to start? Entering the world of Brian McGilloway?
Ooh. Well, I started with the Devlin books, and probably for kind of 2 or 3 reasons. The Devlin books are, it's a first-person narrative. It's a very much a police procedural, and it's set in Lifford, which is this kind of small town in Donegal, just on the southern side of the Irish Republic side of the border. And in actual fact, kind of it and Strabane, where I live, are separated just by a bridge, and the bridge runs up the center, or the border runs up the center of the bridge. And part of the reason why I set it there, I started the very first Devlin that I started writing. I started in Derry, which was my hometown growing up, and is in Northern Ireland. And I couldn't move it forward. I kept worrying about kind of geographical accuracy, and more importantly, worrying about representations of the police.
Ah, right.
Because policing here was such a contentious issue. And when I was writing the book, the RUC had just become the PSNI, so part of the Good Friday kind of process. The old police force, which was seen as being, by some people in the community, would have been seen as being kind of more partisan, perhaps, or more biased to one side than the other. It was re-established as the Police Service of Northern Ireland. They changed the uniform. They brought in a positive discrimination policy to try to bring more Catholics into the police force. And when it was first established, Sinn Féin didn't support it. And were boycotting meetings of the policing board and all this kind of stuff. And it was against that background that I started writing The Devlins. And I didn't know how to write about that police force because it was so new, and the reactions to it were kind of changing daily. And I thought, if I write this as it is now, by the time the book's finished, it'll be instantly anachronistic. Because things will have changed. That's kind of what things were like here. And sure enough, when I finally finished Borderlands, about a fortnight after I finished it, Sinn Féin signed up for the policing board and became members of the policing board. And the other thing was, I didn't feel ready as a writer to write about Northern Ireland. I kind of felt that I wasn't a good enough writer, that I didn't have enough experience. And so I deliberately shifted the book to just the other side of the border so that I could kind of write about it without it being the story.
Those constraints, it's, history writing itself quickly, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And policing in Northern Ireland, certainly over those decades, was one of the more complicated areas of police enforcement in the world, by the sounds of it. So
yeah,
that gave you...
the other thing on that actually too, though, is that the Northern Ireland Police Force were probably one of the best equipped. And if you're writing kind of a crime novel about a border in a sleepy town, you really don't need a police force who are equipped with the best of everything. With 5 months.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, so now here's another question, because you wear two hats, and we've talked about this with other writers before, but you're also writer in residence with the BBC Northern Ireland, working on screenplays and various projects. Now, speaking to lots of writers who usually hand over their works to other writers to adapt. I don't know whether you're adapting your own works for television or film, or whether it's each project you're working on is fresh and new specifically for that particular medium. How do you balance the world of a best-selling novelist with that of a BBC screenwriter?
Well, I mean, the BBC thing actually was about a year and a half. I was writer in residence with them, and then I went back into teaching again. I had been teaching for years, and then I took a kind of a breather for a while, and missed it, and went back in again. In terms of screenwriting, what happened was just I had a story. One year I was kind of doing a novel a year, and one year I had a story that didn't lend itself immediately to a novel. It was a story I kind of wanted to tell from multiple points of view, and kind of paralleling different kind of characters and their kind of journeys or their experiences. And again, I felt maybe I wasn't a good enough novelist to be able to work out how to do that in a kind of satisfactory way in prose. And I love film and I love TV and love that medium, and I kind of thought I'll give it a go. I'll try writing just a screenplay to see what happens, and I'll try telling the story that way instead. And that was really how I got into it. It was like the first book, actually. It was a kind of a fairly selfish exercise in trying it out to see if I could do it.
And did you enjoy it? Do you enjoy it?
I do. It's very different in terms of I tend not to, and I know other writers would think that this is insane. I tend not to know where the books are going. I kind of know about a third of a book at a time, so I kind of know what's going to happen in the first.
My heart rate has just increased, Brian.
Right, okay. But
That'll scare the life out of me.
For me, honestly, and again, it's a selfish thing. If I know how the story's going to end from the beginning, I don't really have the same compulsion to write it because I already know how it's going to end.
That's fascinating. I've never heard that.
That's where
before.
bills come in very handy. I find they're often the best inspiration for getting a book finished.
But also that does lead to an area of danger for you as a writer, and excitement and spontaneity. If it's not all pinned down. I think that's a fascinating way, and I don't know how many writers listening to this work in the same way. But
it's one of those things. Like I remember, I said E.L. Doctorow, who kind of said writing is like driving at night. You can only see as far as the headlights in front of you, but you still get home safely. I very much subscribe to that idea. And in fact, the one book where I didn't know how it was going to end was Little Girl Lost. And by about 3/4 of the way through, I was so convinced that I had dropped far too many hints about the ending that I'd changed the ending completely. Just because I kind of worried that, well, I've known how this is going to end, so I've probably subconsciously layered too many clues and too many kind of foreshadowings of where it ends.
That's a huge talent and skill to be able to have that sort of dexterity. Well, it is. I mean, I'm in awe of that. I mean, I wish I could do the same. I live in fear of not having everything written down. But do you know what? I'm going to try that. I'm going to try the McGilloway method. and
I'm not sure if it's worked out too well, mind you. What you're doing is working fine.
Well, it's worked particularly well for you, obviously. Now, tell me, in a world full of strong female protagonists, tell us a bit about Lucy Black.
Yeah, well, where Lucy came from actually was, I kind of said earlier that Borderlands was, I didn't feel ready to write about Northern Ireland. After 4 books, I did. So I'd written 4 Devlins. I had a 5th contracted. And I went back to the publisher and said, look, I have an idea for a story, but it doesn't really suit Devlin. And the reason for it was it was kind of based on a couple of different things. A couple of years back, in fact, more than that now, we had a really, really bad winter where there was very heavy snow and everybody, it was kind of the country ground to a halt for a couple of weeks. And there were a couple of incidents that happened during that time where children were found walking out in the snow at night in their bedclothes. And I remember listening to the radio. I was going into work one morning, and there was a radio report about a child that had been found, and they were interviewing the doctor, and the doctor commented on the fact that for about the first 40 minutes after the child, or 20 minutes after the child was found, she didn't speak, she didn't cry, she didn't make a sound. And they had wrapped a kind of a heat blanket and stuff around her, and the doctor said after about 20 minutes, she started to scream. And she said it was postponed pain, that the child had become so numbed that their body was unable to register pain. It was only when they became kind of acclimatized to something like normality again that the body began to register its pain. And for me, that was just such a perfect metaphor for Northern Ireland. I mean, it was such a horrific story and such a scary kind of thought as a parent. It's just, you're straight away, you're going, Jesus. But from a writer's point of view, kind of that's us, that's Northern Ireland. We have become so numbed by our experiences and by violence that for a couple of years after the Good Friday Agreement, most people were happy and most people were kind of getting on. There was this honeymoon period. And then when people got used to normality, that's when the pain of compromise started to appear, and that's when issues come up over marching and over flags and over policing and over all the stuff that people had been kind of prepared to let go. So I kind of wanted to explore that idea of postponed pain. And the other thing that kind of happened around the same time was I was speaking to a friend of mine who was a psychologist. Not in a professional capacity, I should point out. He commented about, we were talking about fairy tales. I can't even remember why. I think we were talking about books and why I set books in Woodlands, and kind of I said I just love the whole fairy tale thing. And he commented that when children have gone through some form of trauma, quite often they will associate with a particular fairy tale. And he said quite often what will happen is if you can find out what the fairy tale is that the child most closely associates with, then you get a sense of what form of trauma they have gone through. So everyone who has gone through emotional neglect, for example, will tend to perhaps associate with Hansel and Gretel, because it's about parental abandonment and separation anxiety. And so I had this idea about a child who's found in the woods, who's not able to speak because she has experienced something that just has kind of left her with selective mutism. And I wanted a detective to sit with her at night in hospital, reading her stories, not to investigate, but just to read her stories, because there was nobody claimed her, nobody was looking for her, and this detective would feel sorry for her, would sit reading her stories night after night, and then one night, one of the stories would trigger a reaction. And that was kind of the basis for it. And I knew straight away it couldn't be Devlin, because I knew they wouldn't have a male detective sitting with a child by themselves. And also Devlin, one of the things that for me had made him kind of unique was he had a family, he had kids of his own. And he wouldn't be sitting in a hospital with somebody else's child. Now, around the same time, my wife got pregnant with our daughter. We had 3 boys, and then we had a girl, Lucy. And I kind of wanted to write a character for her, a strong, kind of decent, driven character who would try to do the right thing and would treat people with kind of integrity and decency. And that's really where Lucy came from.
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, you're a best-selling novelist, Brian. You're a screenwriter. You're a teacher. And I believe if someone asked you to light the theatrical production of Hamlet at the Belfast Lyric, you could do that as well. As they once said of the late, great Roy Castle, the Glasgow Empire, is there no end to your talent? Tell us a little bit.
There's no beginning to my talent. Absolutely none.
Do you still enjoy the theatre? And might there be theatrical theatre aspirations? May any of your characters find themselves like Ian's got Rebus opening in Birmingham this year, and Peter James has Roy Grace treading the boards for, I think, the 5th year in his productions. Can you see any of your leading characters or your books being adapted for theatrical purposes?
I honestly, I don't know. I mean, funnily, the book that I have just finished, I started writing it as a play. I haven't written a play in years. I mean, I kind of started it when I was young, obviously, like I think we probably all did. We all wrote stories and kind of wrote, like when I was 8, I was a huge fan of Airwolf. And I wrote my first novel, which was about 6 pages long. It was called Sky Fox. It was just a complete rip-off about a technological helicopter being stolen in Derry and being used to fight crime. I might go back to that idea, actually.
It's good.
No one will notice.
And then whenever I was 16, I did the thing that was required of everybody who wanted to be a writer in Northern Ireland, which was writing a story about Catholics and Protestants falling in love over barricades.
Yes.
And then for a while, I kind of wrote plays instead. And haven't in years. I mean, I think the last thing I wrote was probably when I was about 19 or 20. And the story that I've just finished, again, was one of those ones that I struggled to kind of find an entry point to. And a friend of mine actually said, why don't you try writing it as a play? And I started it as a play and really just didn't think I was good enough to write it. I think theatre, because it's live, because you have that instant reaction, I think to write good theatre, you need to be really talented. And I'm not saying you don't need to be talented to be a writer of any form, but I think theatre, because it's such an immediate response, and partly as well, and it's a wee bit, I suppose, similar with screenwriting. With a book, you know that the reader can go back. You know that the reader can kind of spend a moment thinking about a line and teasing out the implications of a line. You don't really have that with a play.
No, you don't have that luxury, do you? No. No,
because once it's gone, and you need to make sure that whatever it is that you were trying to get across, whatever you were trying to communicate, worked instantly the first time. So it's a real skill, and I don't know if I have it.
Well, but you're. Well, I bet you do, and it's good to hear that you're exploring it still. I mean, you know, it's not just looking at your formatting and saying I'll do the play structure today. You actually have, this goes back a long way with you, and obviously, you know, you won the National Irish Student Drama Association Award for theatrical lighting. You know, so the theatre must have been one of your first ways into the arts, I suppose.
Well, and it was something that I did at university, and I met so many kind of good friends through. And the lighting thing was purely and simply kind of making money. It was a way to pay my way through university.
A very creative way to do it.
I don't know if I could do it anymore. Whenever I think back to kind of 18, 19-year-old me running up and down ladders and kind of hanging off lighting bars, like if my own children were thinking about it, I would be death on it. It would not and I couldn't do it.
It's dangerous. I know. Whenever I'm in the theatre, during a tech rehearsal, I look up at the I don't mean this in a derogatory way. The tech monkeys, literally swinging from the tops of the theatre, and goodness knows what, doing the most extraordinary thing. And it's always the lighting department that are doing that. But listen, Brian, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today, and as I say, listeners to Partners in Crime will be rushing to your books to buy them. Lee Child described your books as the fact that you blend timeless values with ripped from the headlines issues to produce some of the best crime fiction writing today, which is an accolade indeed, and is absolutely true. So thanks for joining us on Partners in Crime. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Wow.
Well, entertaining or what? And not only that, as I just gave the Lee Child line for Brian's books, he really does blend that timeless values with the ripped from headlines issues, and he's a man obviously who, like many of the most successful writers we talk to, writes about what he knows. And coming from a particularly, over the centrist troubled part of the world, and he incorporates that into his book so brilliantly and relevantly, and is constantly updating. It was very interesting what he was talking about, how quickly, they say a week is a long time in politics, and how with the constantly changing setups with the police force and the political changes in Northern Ireland, you can write a book in March and it be totally out of date by publication in September. So the challenges for a writer setting his books in Northern Ireland and across the border in Ayr are obviously great, but one that Brian has managed to do superbly with both his series, and I for one can't wait to get stuck into them.
Well, we've spoken many times on this show about the importance of setting in crime fiction. Setting is more than just physical location. It's the
political,
backdrop.
it's religious,
exactly.
It's environmental.
And that's never more stark than it is in these books, because it's just such an atmospheric setting. There's so much complexity there that's that just feeds into these stories and makes them so rich and so powerful. So highly recommended.
Yes,
Brian's books.
I think that was a great interview, and Brian, if you're listening, thanks again.
He will. He's a fan of the show, he told us.
Well,
on the off-air comments.
He was almost perfect.
Everyone has their flaws. But please do head over to Kobo and grab a copy of one of Brian's books. If it's your first purchase with Kobo, then enter the promo code CRIME at the checkout and your book will be discounted by 90%, which is extraordinary. So your book will cost you mere pennies or cents or shekels or
whatever
whatever your local currency is, I suppose. Yeah. Kobo's available all over the world and is enormous in lots of countries. I noticed my books sell in all sorts of countries. They're Estonia, Macedonia, Puerto Rico, literally every country in the world.
Yes, they give a little map. It's a great platform actually for a writer, because they give a little map, and if you're checking where your books have been sold, there's a map of the world, and a little blue circle comes up when a book's been sold, as I mentioned earlier, in Lithuania or Tobago or South Africa or New Zealand or particularly Canada or whatever, and you can just see that little blue circle over any given month getting a bit bigger as your book sales sort of.
What you want to see is look like there's a worldwide epidemic of pox, and just see these sort of spots appearing all over the globe.
You're a best-selling author if, in actual fact, the world map is covered in big blue circles.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kobo, for that. It's a wonderful image and easy for this particular brain to use and appreciate.
Better than numbers, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh,
you just look at it and go,
look at
Tobago's over there.
Apart from any spreadsheet to do with my work, is usually a matter of great tragedy. But no, thank you, Kobo, for that.
Right.
And of course, did we do another discount? Is this a time of the show where you do another one of those?
I just did it, didn't I?
Was that? Did you?
I told them to go over to Brian's books on Kobo.
You know, one day I should do that. I mean, you do it so wonderfully smoothly. I wouldn't, and I think it's about time. It was done very badly by me.
Why don't you do the contact details? Have a stab at those.
I don't know them.
Exactly. You can email us. Hello.
I'll listen very carefully for once.
Yes.
Give us the contact details.
The email address, remember this one, is hello@partnersincrime.online.
Yes.
The Twitter handle is at crimeficpodcast, FIC podcast. Facebook is facebook.com/partnersincrime-podcast.
Yes.
The website, I believe, is partnersincrime.online. You could send a carrier pigeon or smoke signals. I mean, they might reach us. I wouldn't know how to
Now you're
decipher
talking
them.
carrier pigeon. Excuse me, I'm going to have another slurp. Caffeine is essential at this point. Oh, that's better.
I think that will do.
Partners in Crime was presented by Adam Croft and Robert Dawes and produced by Adam Croft. The theme tune was by the Caesareans. The Partners in Crime logo and imagery were designed by Stuart Beisch. Partners in Crime is sponsored by Kobo, your favourite local bookshop, perfected.